Hey, what up there, Dan here, aka the Comic Concierge, and this is one of my graphic thoughts videos. This is where I pick 3 graphic novels, trades, or mangas and give my thoughts and opinions on them. And don't worry about any spoilers, I won't be going into any minute detail, just my general thoughts and opinions. And if you're all worried, check out below because there'll be chapters as well as timestamps for you to make it a little bit easier. But let's get to the books we'll be talking about this week. First up, we have Freiheit. Our second book is Infinitum. And lastly, we have the Black Panther Party. Let's get to our first book, Freiheit, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. It is German. My German is not all that great, and I actually did try to Google it to see if I can get the pronunciation correctly. So hopefully I did okay. And what is this book about? What is Freiheit about? It, with the German title, it is a story based in Germany during the Nazi occupation, during the rise of the Nazi regime. And this comes from us from the world of Plough comics and is written and drawn by Andrea, Grosso, Ciponte. And again, it's about the rise of the Nazi regime, and it focuses on these three individuals. It's based upon a true story, and it's about them attempting to rebel against the rise of the Nazi fascism. And how do they do that? Do they do it through force? Not necessarily. They actually use the power of the written word. One thing they use a lot are these leaflets. And actually the leaflets that they actually produce at the time, the ones that they would use to spread their message to try to break up the propaganda of the Nazi party are published in the back. And there's 4 separate leaflets, and it's just, as you read through them, it is like reading like these historical documents, and you see they become a little bit more aggressive throughout as I think they realize the plight that they're going through. And you just see them kind of going through this attempt to fight back against a system they clearly do not believe in, and the dangers that lurk in every corner. Often we look at the how people can fight against a system in a more physical sense, and I thought this did a really good job of just captivating how there are multiple ways to fight back against a system that you don't believe in, and how important just the role of information is and how people can control it. And when you control information, you pretty much control everything. You can control belief, you can control action, and how important that part was to why the Nazis were able to accomplish what they did. And we often see resistance, but usually the resistance stories we see portrayed are typically like the French resistance, for example. Rarely are people like that are in the heart of it. You actually have people in here that are fighting against it that also have to become German soldiers, despite the fact that they don't actually want to fight for that cause, but they really have no belief. And you could see why they are as fearful as they are, knowing that if they're found, if they're caught, not only does it put the danger of themselves, doesn't put themselves in danger, but their friends, family, anyone. And the truth is, you don't know necessarily who to trust. For example, a person who plays a key role in this is a secretary, and there was a trust in how she basically overheard individuals talking about what they're doing, turns them in, and there's some negative repercussions there. When I look at a nonfiction story like this, or one that's based upon nonfiction, some things I look for is it telling a story that needs to be told? And I feel like this definitely checks that box, because it's one I've never heard about personally, despite the fact that it's pretty remarkable what these individuals did. Was their impact wide? I don't necessarily, it's hard to actually argue or really quantify that, I would think. I think there certainly was some impact. It's hard to really say exactly what it was, but when you read through this, you would just think that what they were doing was a small positive in a world of the ultimate negative. And beyond the fact, is it a story that should be told? How well told is it? It's one thing to have an interesting story, have a great subject matter. Just because this can be an important story doesn't necessarily mean the story that ends up on the page is equivalent to that. And I do think looking at the general story was effective in getting to know these individuals. It didn't feel dry. You felt like these people were complete characters. You could remove the fact this was based upon a true story, and it's still an interesting tale. Looking at the art style, I did like the art. One thing that was really apparent with this, that was the panels were wide and large, and there's just a lot of room on the page. The coloring design, there's like this weird texture to it. It was like the entire world had a cloud over it in a way where everything was a bit fuzzy, like nothing was completely clear, like the focus was off just a little bit, like a nice little painterly quality to it. And I think it certainly, helped emphasize the fact that this was real events, because these characters look real, the world looked real, but it was still stylized, but not overtly stylized. It's a really hard line to draw when you're talking about events like this that are extremely serious, and you want to be able to tell them in an artistic fashion, but do it in a way that's appropriate, that is kind of not out of line of the story you're telling. And thinking of something like how Schindler's List, for example, like that's all in black and white except for one scene with a young girl in a red dress. It's a stylistic choice, but it's a powerful stylistic choice. It's not one I feel like is trying to overly call attention to the filmmaker. It's calling, I think, attention to the innocence that's being lost in that moment. I think that's similar to here. I think the colors in general are very dark and moody. It can be a bit dull in that, but I feel like it's purposeful. If it was bright and kind of caught your eye in that way, I don't think it would necessarily correspond with the story that's being told. But I think generally the art style fits the story, ultimately the most important thing. And as I mentioned, the panel design, a lot of wide panels, a lot of panels that kind of fill up the page with these imposing figures. And I think one scene in particular, when you do see these individuals kind of at times coming in and being put on trial, how they're often so small on the page, just to showcase the overwhelming obstacles that they're facing, with how this regime is consistently hanging over them. They're always this threat. And then beyond that, just the story itself. And we think about it, like when you do something like this, the small details, like you're thinking, oh, they're just spreading out these leaflets or putting in messages on them. Well, that's an interesting story, but I think this gets to some of the details, like how hard is it to get paper? Like when a big part of this is getting the right types of paper in order to do this. And in order to do that, you have to be relatively mindful of that, because if you're showing up to a location buying a lot of paper or buying a lot of materials that would create something like this, it's going to cause suspicion if people are aware of what's going on. So just every little thing you had to do in order to do something that, in all honesty, they didn't necessarily have to do, but they chose to, despite what it led to and what it could lead to. So I would highly recommend this. I know World War II is one of those things that is represented a lot in both movies, television, comics. It can be a very worn road to travel when it comes to storytelling. But again, I think this was a little bit different because it's a side of it we don't necessarily see, at least on the Western side. We don't necessarily see this viewpoint all that much. So that made it a little bit different. And generally, the message being here, although regarding a specific event, I think it's relatively universal, and I think even ties into some of the other books I'll talk about today. So definitely recommend. It's one I think really worth your time. It's generally a pretty quick read. You can see it's not that long of a book, but I do think one of the best parts, I did like the choice of them putting the leaflets in the back and just reading through those. So getting context of what they did, and was really helpful. The next book I'm going to talk about is Infinitum. And again, this is a very different type of book compared to the other two. This is, of course, starting with the fact that it is a fiction book. It's also a very different type of design. You see usually comics are the other shape. Usually they're like this, but this one is round in this manner. And it's more of a comic prose style, combination prose and comics, rather than your typical comics. This is not a book where you're going to read it and it has a 6-panel, 9-panel grid. You have one page of text typically, and another page of an image, one still but moving image. And I like that because I like getting different styles, giving different varieties in the medium of comics. It's a type of style I don't see very often anymore. It was certainly common. It happens here and there, like DC had their hidden universe book that was done that talked about things like Black Lightning, that was done in a very similar style through Black Label. This is written and drawn by Tim Fiedler, and he does really everything with this book. The story is about King Aja Uba and his queen Lula, and it opens up, and they're basically around the time it almost seems like ancient Egypt era, and they're ruling over this land. But what happens is Lula is unable to bear children. In order to kind of keep their power going, the king uses another individual, basically this witch sorceress, to help birth a child. And during that process, when the child is born, they take it from her, and in the process she's killed, and actually levies a curse on the king. And the curse kind of causes him to become immortal. He lives forever. He lives to see his son die. He lives to see his kingdom fall. He lives to see his wife die. And what starts in the basically ancient Egypt area has a massive scope. He eventually becomes a wanderer. He ends up becoming a slave. He empowers individuals during his time as a slave to go the Underground Railroad. He fights in wars. It goes into it goes into present day. It goes beyond that. It goes into the future. It's a pretty wide scope of a story. Like it's one that when you just look at time period, it's hard to really top because of the amount of time that it's covered in this, focusing on one character. And looking at the art style is, it does have like an animated quality to it. Each image, they're typically striking. They're well told. If I had some issues with the overall imagery of the book, it came down to the coloring, because I felt times the coloring was so saturated in dark colors at times, it really hindered the line work, where you couldn't see much within the image itself because it was just so dark and bleak. It wasn't always the case, but especially on the early ongoing, some of the moments that are meant to be rather poignant and powerful, I think, are hindered a bit. And looking at the lettering choice, there's a lot of stylized lettering within this on the different pages. Like it's stylistically, I think it kind of looks cool, but when it comes to reading, I felt like it hindered it more than anything, because it just put more obstacles on the page for you to read rather than just being, words on the page. I think, lettering is a difficult thing to do when you're going to add a lot of style and things to it. It's one thing if you're like adding style to like a sound effect or something like that on a page, because you're looking for the impact of that. You're not necessarily reading that for comprehension. But when you're putting that type of style, like different colors and fonts on a page, and that's meant to be what you're reading, I think it makes it a little bit more challenging of a read. It at least did for me. So those were some of my drawbacks to it, the coloring choices, and then just some of the use of the lettering. I thought it did more harm than good. It looked cool from afar, but the actual utility of it, I thought, was a little cumbersome in general. But the story itself is immersive, and I didn't know where this was going at all when I picked it up. I kind of like just blind reading things. Just, this is a new book, let me try it out. I didn't even know what format it was in at all. Like, I didn't know it was like this. And the first thing I was stricken by was the overall art. I did think it's very digital. It's a very digital look to it, and that might draw some people. But I thought on the emotion side, just the consistency through it was rather welcoming. And I do like styles like this. It's a little bit more wordy of a read, like you are when you're reading half a book, half a comic. But I thought when you considered how much time is being kind of covered within this, it made a lot of sense. And I think it really started going for me once it got into the fact that you had him going into the slave trade and seeing him kind of react to becoming a part of the Underground Railroad. And then two, you see, although he's immortal, he can be inflicted with wounds. Wounds can hurt him. And then that challenge, I thought that was a nice little wrinkle too, because unlike something like Berserker, for example, or Wolverine, that they're immortal because they can kind of heal themselves. That necessarily isn't the case exactly with this character. And at times, like, he has to overcome like many wounds, and over a lifespan of being this kind of impressive warrior that has taken on all challenges from all different types of the world at all different time periods, those wounds start to kind of add up. And I thought that element, seeing him deal with that. But then again, when it gets into the future, like that, I'm like, oh wow, we're actually going this far. It hits it into another gear entirely. So despite my quibbles, I did like it. Like I said, I do think it's a work that you're going to have to let wash over you a bit and kind of escape into this world. But once I did that, I was relatively impressed with the craftsmanship. And again, I love seeing comics being approached through different methods and through different techniques. Craftsmanship is something I really look for when it comes to like how I appreciate comics. And I thought the craftsmanship here was unique. Maybe all didn't always work for me. It took a lot of chances, and sometimes chances pay off, sometimes they don't. But I'd rather see someone take a chance and it failed and then be something that's just generally mundane and uninteresting. So it's a good balancing act. And I thought overall, when it came to balancing, I enjoyed much more than I disliked. When it came kind of to fighting oppression, as I talked about this overcoming impossible odds, again, this goes back to him being thrown into a system. It's a good like microcosm of the issues that we've seen in the United States dealing with race, because he is this African individual that is being treated, despite the fact that he was literally a king, now being treated low of the low, but not stopping there, fighting back against that. Because of this curse that he now has, he has that ability. But again, we see, despite the fact that he, is fighting these odds, those scars really impact him, and they are there for a long time. And I think that is certainly something that I don't think is at all an accident, indicating that those wounds that have been suffered and those wounds that started way back in the 16 and 1500s are still relevant today. And seeing King Aja being the individual that connects all those made a lot of sense. But then again, it went into even further beyond that. So just to see what people thought of this. I haven't heard many people talk about this, which I think is a shame, because there's a lot here to talk about. There's a lot here to dissect on all different levels, maybe because it's outside the norm of the style. People are just a bit missing it, but again, I would highly advise checking it out and see what you think of it. Last this week, we have the Black Panther Party. And again, this is a nonfiction take on the history of the Black Panther Party. It is written by David F. Walker with art by Marcus Kwame Anderson. And I'm a huge fan of David F. Walker as a writer. I feel like he's relatively really underrated in the world of comics. And he's done his Power Man and Iron Fist run with Sanford Green was great. He's part of Bitterroot as well. He's part of that writing team. That's been fantastic. His work on Nighthawk. He was a co-writer on Naomi. Actually even did a really fun Cable and Deadpool one-shot back when the movie was coming out a few years ago. That was like, wow, it has a versatile style that is something that you don't see nearly enough, because I think he can really approach a variety of different characters. I wish he got a little bit more chance to tell bigger stories. Unfortunately, a lot of his books end up being really good, but don't necessarily have the longevity they should. Like his Nighthawk run, unfortunately, got canceled way too soon. But it's great seeing him doing a book like this, with Judas and the Black Messiah coming out. I think this is a good 1-2 punch. This is very different than that. This isn't necessarily, it is following the history of the Black Panther Party, but it's not necessarily a narrative per se. It is much more an informational take. And I thought this did a really good job of just providing context to a lot of key elements. It's the amount of detail and the amount of information in this is pretty impressive. And when I look about just the individuals that they touch upon, the event, this is an endless balancing act. And I've read a lot of books that cover important information that, it's like, this is cool things to know. These are important things to know. And it can be overwhelming at times, or end up being relatively dry, where you just feel like you're reading a textbook. This, I thought, avoided that for two key reasons. One, providing a lot of context to like how we even get to the point that Black Panther Party is even beginning, before we even get there, like setting up the stage. And when you get to the individuals who started it, like, it shifts focus, and it's more like a first-hand account, more like a classic comic with general conversations happening with some narration. So it feels like you're there in the moment relatively, instead of outside being an observer. A good example of showing, not just telling. Also, generally, I think a well put together and a graphic design piece. For example, you'll get these specific pages when you have an important figure that's about to play a key role. In order to introduce them, you get a page. They often will get a page, and it'll be a striking image, potentially even linking to some relatively iconic imagery, and then some key details about that individual, some key catchment boxes to have an understanding of who that person is, where they're coming from, and what role they play. And then as the story continues, you have that context, so when they show up, everything makes a little bit more sense, and you can kind of connect all the dots. So despite the fact you're getting a lot of information, it's divvied out in a very helpful and informative way. And I think this is, again, a very important story to learn, because the Black Panther Party, or Black Panther Party for self-defense, as it was first came up, it even gets into how there were different versions of the Black Panther Party, some of the controversy behind them, where they come from, what was their purpose. A big part of this, too, is the gun debate, and how guns play a key role in the foundation of the Black Panther Party. And interesting seeing how individuals will kind of change their role on guns depending upon who has them. For example, there's this incident called the Sacramento incident that deals with Ronald Reagan back when he was governor of California. And you had the Black Panther Party show up to a location where they knew Ronald Reagan would be in there with weapons, and knowing that they were following the law. They were very keen on making sure that they were following the law, not breaking any laws, being educated regarding their rights, not the rights that they're told that maybe society tells them, but what the rights that they have written in the Constitution and actual state laws. So then you see the reaction of individuals, and there's this sequence in which they're going actually to the state government to try to challenge this law they're trying to enact, and they get lost in the commons trying to find their way. And when they finally do, by mistake, instead of going into the place that they're allowed to by law, they go in the wrong door. And unfortunately, it causes some problems there. But there's also a lot of tragedy in this as well. And I think it tries to get through the myths. It tries to cut through kind of what people talk about the Black Panther Party and actually what really happened. And it's very educational in that sense, understanding the complete picture of what they did, what their pillars are. You learn about the 10 pillars that established the Black Panther Party for self-defense, and also how there were a multitude of different Black Panther Party organizations that all did different things, that had different viewpoints, some that weren't as militant as others, and the conflict that kind of ensued within them, but how they would often still work together. Looking at the art, I mentioned how it was just really well designed, well put together, and I thought the art too, when it came to representing real individuals on the page, like you felt like you were looking at real people, but not in the sense of like it had that uncanny valley where people didn't look too real. They had a cartooning aspect, and I feel weird saying the word cartooning with a comic like this, but they certainly were comic book characters drawn like general comic book characters. But when you had like striking, almost poster like images, you saw who they were. It was good representation of these individuals on a sense of understanding that these were real people, and a lot of people that plainly I never heard about, didn't know their stories. I think this is a book you could probably put in a school, and it probably should put in a school, especially for your high school kids, if you have a high school kid, or even college age, just to see this information, learn this story. If you enjoyed like Judas and the Black Messiah, and you found that compelling, to get more context, to get more background, and the amount of information that's covered here is, it's well detailed, well researched, but I still feel like at the end of the day, I'm not just learning, I'm seeing a story being told, which makes it even that more compelling. And, it tries to get the complete picture. It tries to, I think, show the bad and the good, the tragedy that occurred, and the way it ends too is just, completely heartbreaking. And seeing how the message that they were compelling, that their mission, well, at many times was successful, clearly, is still something that has not been fully realized yet. So beyond that, looking how this compares to something like Freiheit, where you have individuals utilizing things like leaflets to kind of dispel the messaging of the Nazi regime, the Black Panthers as well utilize similar techniques, to cultivate information, utilizing their own newsletter, to put things out there to educate individuals, from everything from voter registration, just to make people aware of the rights they have and what they can and cannot accomplish. If they had a different political agenda, or if they wanted to spread the word about something, just to break down the system of oppression, utilizing that information was just a powerful tool as the guns they would use to protect themselves. And what's very different with this compared to something like Freiheit, where Freiheit is a narrative beginning to end, where it's more like based upon a true story. In this, you have narrative pieces, like I mentioned. You'll get inserts of individuals communicating and talking with one another to provide context. I feel like you're seeing in real history in action beyond just the details. Those narrative pieces were a small portion of this, though, where it was more about providing you the information and the detail about what happened, but in a narrative sense. The narrative here wasn't necessarily about the story, it was about the history. And I think history is much more interesting when you can tell it like you're telling a story. It's not just, here's a date, here's what happened, move on to the next thing. Here's a date, here's what happened, here's the next thing. It's linking all together like you would as if you were telling a story. Like, here's the beginning, here's the end, and here's the cause, here's the effect, going in for bit. It does maybe do a little bit of jumping because you have a lot of ground to cover, but because of the way it's told, where you're not just feeling like you're being bombarded with dry dates and details, it's much more captivating in that sense. And David Ed Walker recently did like a Frederick Douglass book, and I felt like it was similar to that, where the difference between here, of course, is that you have a wider range of information. Ultimately, though, when I look at this book, I think why I liked it as much as I did is because, again, going back to the idea of information and the power it holds, it breaks down regimes, but also I think it can place us in bubbles. It can put us in places that we have certain viewpoints of individuals. Like, growing up as a kid, like I didn't really know much about the Black Panthers. I think my only really information I received, or my limited knowledge, was based upon their minor scene in Forrest Gump. and things like that. Like the details, we didn't learn about them in history class. My parents weren't people that were going to talk about them. They were, almost mystical figures in a way, and mostly seen in a negative sense, almost like a pseudo-terrorist type of organization. But then you get a book like this, and it can inform the uninformed. It can let you know about important people that you never heard of and how they have had such a huge impact. Like, we hear the term Black Power. Well, where did that come from? And learning that, learning about people's lives, the sacrifices they made. But it's also not shining away the fact that, there's a lot of tragedy in this story, and the anger that's there and understanding that anger. So, of all the books I read this week, I do think this was by far the best. I like the other ones. They had their moments, but on a craftsmanship level, on an importance level, I just thought this was far and away the most compelling thing I read. And it was something I think I will go back to. I actually did buy this on the other books I got from the library, but I'm glad I bought this because I feel like it is something I would go back and reference, because there is a lot of information here. I tried to retain as much as I could, but there are small details, names, things like that didn't immediately stick. So going back and rereading it, learning is fundamental in all this, I say. Well, anyways, that's it for me for this week. I did want to mention that the Comic Concierge is also on a podcast. So if you'd rather listen to that way, just search Comic Concierge in your podcast app and you'll be able to find it. And outside of that, just want to thank you for taking the time to check out this video. Appreciate that. Let me know what you thought of this book. What books have you been reading? Let me know in the comment section below. But just remember, comics are for everyone. The key is finding the right one. Until next time, keep reading.